All right, from Emerge Africa, I would like to say welcome to you, Taskeen, to this session on decolonization of this kind of like mini series that we are running, with this being the first session. So today we're speaking about decolonizing learning design. Just to present briefly, Dr. Taskeen Adam. She's an associate manager with Open Development and Education and a senior research lead at the EdTech Hub. I'm sure we're going to hear a bit more about the EdTech Hub, especially. So she spent her time between South Africa and the States. And yes, she'll be leading this workshop. And I think I actually just going to hand over to you, Taskeen, for you to kick off this workshop.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Sure, so thank you so much for having me today. And today I'm going to be presenting a bit from my PhD work. Can I just check, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, all good? All right, great. Yeah, so today I'm going to be presenting from my PhD research and then also kind of merge that with the lessons I've learned over the past 2 years during the pandemic and how that feeds into the topic of decolonizing learning design. So yeah, I'm from 2 organizations today. So Open Development and Education, which is also a consortium member of the EdTech Hub. And the EdTech Hub basically focuses on how we can use technology in education and supports research to build evidence around the most effective use of technology in education, particularly to support decision makers in the use of this, so in the use of EdTech. And before I kick off today, I just want to acknowledge my positionality in this space. So I'm South African, I'm Indian, and in some ways, I do feel like, you know, I'm the optimal person to speak about this as someone between spaces. But on the other hand, I also feel like I've studied abroad. I've studied at the University of Cambridge, and that somewhat gives me a louder voice than others in terms of being heard. So I'm also quite conscious of that. But nevertheless, I hope that I'm able to at least impart some useful nuggets that can help you support designing better online and hybrid courses. And also, just another caveat is that the slide deck I'm going to present today is a bit more dense than I would have usually wanted, but I did want to jam a lot of content in, and I will share the slides afterwards, so you don't need to worry about jotting down too many notes. But yeah, hoping that will help along the way as sort of like a resource afterwards. And lastly, this is going to be approximately like 1.5 hours. The first hour will be me presenting with a little bit of interactivity, little interactive events now and then. And then in the last half an hour, we'll have some breakouts and a question and answer session. So we'll be using Jamboards then. And so if you feel like you want to switch to your laptop, to better be able to participate in that, you have the next hour to do so. So yeah, just to outline what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about what my research was about and all the different conceptual frameworks that I put together to form my understandings of what decolonization or what decolonizing EdTech and learning design might mean from these different schools of thought. And then in the second half of the presentation, it'll be a little bit more practical in terms of showing you about the approaches to designing justice-oriented MOOCs. And throughout the presentation, I'll be saying MOOCs, and MOOCs stand for Massive Open Online Courses. But you might not be a specific MOOC designer, you might just be an online course designer, and there'll be many opportunities for you to draw lessons from my MOOC research into designing online courses in general. So yeah, let's look at the research. So where did this all start? Basically, I started my PhD around the time of Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements. So naturally, this infused the background of my research. And just taking a step back, looking at the educational context in South Africa, we all know about the history of colonialism and apartheid and how that has impacted the education systems and led to large inequalities. However, those inequalities are not just material. So in the current state, we have material injustices. And in some instances, they say that actually it's the current policies that are present in education today can actually have actually further exacerbated inequalities. And the other layer on top of that is not just material, so it's not just financial or socioeconomic inequalities, it's also epistemic injustices, where the majority Black students might not feel accepted or in a space that they belong. So it can be culturally alienating for students of color in a place that is quite Eurocentric despite being in South Africa. So that's on the one side of things. And on the other side of things, we have the shift online. So my research started when many South African universities were the first to join this MOOC movement, which meant like shifting online and sort of testing out these ideas of presenting courses to a global audience. And when I started my research, this was quite a niche and innovative thing. But since then, COVID has hit, and almost everyone has had to learn how to present online, how to teach online, as well as deal with the exacerbated inequalities that have come through this pivot online. So that's sort of the context of my research. Now, what are MOOCs? So a couple of years ago when I presented this, it was actually pretty straightforward to say what a MOOC was: massive open online courses. But since then, the space of MOOCs has blurred so much that it's really hard to give a straightforward definition. I think the only word that still holds true in the acronym is massive. And that's when thousands of students from across the globe sign up for a course. And with that, it means that you have people from different countries, different locations, different socioeconomic groups that come together online. And that's where this concept of like diversity and difference really was embedded in this, because you're teaching to a global audience. In terms of open, MOOCs have never really been completely open. It really depended on the person who was setting it up. But ideally, if a MOOC was open, all of its content would be under some sort of Creative Commons license. It would be adaptable. You'd be able to take it offline, add subtitles to it, for example. But that was never really the case with a lot of MOOCs. And it was really from institute to institute. And in some cases, this was often beyond the MOOC designer's abilities. It might have been an institutional rule that the content was copyright. So that had always been a question mark in the space. And in terms of online, a lot of MOOCs have followed different patterns. So some have wrapped MOOCs or hybrid MOOCs when there's an online and offline version. MOOCs historically was split between what we'd call connectivist MOOCs and extension MOOCs, but in reality, most MOOCs these days do have a mixture between the two. And so connectivist ones talked more about learning within the peer network and out of the space of the MOOC platform, whereas extended ones were more of a traditional stereotypical online course. And many MOOCs these days have shifted to having certificates, or institutional credits, or can follow up into more of a diploma. And what that has meant within the MOOC space is that MOOCs that used to be more about like sort of catchy, interesting little topics have become more mainstream and more traditional in the types of topics that they've offered, because they now fit into traditional degrees. Okay, so let's actually go to what my research was about. So I wanted to understand the extent that MOOCs do or could particularly for marginalized groups in South Africa, how it could support their needs, preferences, and aspirations within education, and how they could be designed to address the material, cultural, epistemic, political, and geopolitical injustices they face. That's quite a mouthful, but I'll be packing out those two angles a bit more in the presentation today. But just broadly explained, there were two groups in my study. So the potential MOOC participants who were non-university students, so they were post-secondary students, and then MOOC designers that were from a variety of different South African universities, so 4 South African universities and 2 universities in the USA, because I wanted to understand the differences between South African MOOC designers and US MOOC designers. And the participants were from Gauteng, KZN, and Limpopo, so various peri-urban regions, Cosmos City, Ivory Park, Umgababa, and Mangweng. And with both groups, I first tried to understand their positions, who they are, what their needs and their preferences are, and then how they viewed justice with respect to their education. So I drew on a variety of different conceptual frameworks, and the first was, as this research came out of the open education space, because MOOCs typically embody this idea of openness, I looked at the open education movement and the critiques within that space. So the first critique that I looked at was the neoliberal critique, and this problematized the idea of open washing. And this is when open terminology is used, but it doesn't actually embrace what openness means. So is it free to access? Is it open licensing? And often, sometimes you'd come across this open washing, where open was just used for branding or marketing or commercial interests. So sort of like some freemium model where it seems open, but actually you have to pay later. So these are not really open, but they sort of use the terminology to brand their product. The next was the social injustice critique. And this kind of problematized the idea of openness, that open is good in and of itself. And it centered the idea of social injustices and the need to address educational inequalities. So here the preface was, openness does not equal equality or equity, right? You still have to take extra levels to make sure that something is that is open is also striving for equity. And then thirdly, the neocolonial critique built upon the social injustice critique, but it further emphasized the cultural, epistemic, and the geopolitical imbalances in the open education movement, such as the languages that content is created, who are the main creators and developers of open educational resources, and who are the recipients of it. Challenge this idea of that open is just inherently good, like to be open is a good thing. Looking at, for example, that some knowledges might need to be protected or are reserved for certain respected people in an indigenous community, for example. And it also problematized the direction, the flow of knowledge, where some sources, Euro-American sources of knowledge, tend to be given privilege as to their authenticity. And yeah, so that was the background of the open education movement. Now, when I talk about decolonization or what we are decolonizing, it's often important to look at this within the bigger picture. And often I think those of you who work at universities may be familiar with the whole decolonizing the curriculum. And this diagram is really important to me because it shows that you can't just decolonize one part, or you can't strive to decolonizing just one sector. Everything is linked together, right? So you have decolonization of the curricula, but also decolonizing the university, when it also has to look at management and power, institutional culture, access, staff, just the concept of disciplinarity. I love that so many people are from different fields today, because that's like breaking down those barriers between different fields is really important. Then also looking at decolonizing education, not just at the university space, but right from early childhood development to looking at informal TVET colleges as well. And then understanding that it's not just about education, right? There's land, there's governance, there's urban planning, there's medical care, culture, language, legislation. All of these fit into the bigger picture of decolonizing. Right. And now moving on to the term of decoloniality. So I use the term by Maldonado Torres, and this says that decoloniality involves the dismantling of relations of power and conceptions of knowledge that foment the reproduction of racial, gender, geopolitical hierarchies that come into being or form new and more powerful forms of expression in the modern colonial world. And so the whole new, that came into being or found new refers to the fact that colonialism didn't just end at when states reached independence. There's also the colonization of the mind, the colonization of the being that continues on today. So that's the idea of coloniality, that although these formal structures might have broken down, the idea of power and that indirect rule is still there. So it's quite easy to say the definition and the theory of it, but what does this mean in practice? And that has been much more difficult. And I'm going to tell you like 3 different sort of interpretations in a practical way of what decoloniality means. So, and all of these have been present in African universities at different points in time. And the reason I want to highlight it is that there's a lot of people who are not familiar with this space just write off decolonization as one word, as one thing, and they may take a particular interpretation, but actually there's a lot of debate and discourse within the decolonial space about what it actually means. So the first one is Africanization, and this is the idea that we need to replace European knowledges by local and indigenous knowledges. So that would just be like rejecting everything, like to the extreme. Let's say, we no longer use English as our medium of instruction, right? So in this sort of stance, it allows for marginalized knowledges to be reclaimed and given their place, but it also runs the risk of co-option by local knowledges for political and national agendas. So the idea that it's so easy just to switch over, it's quite difficult because there's still inequality that can be caused at the national level by particular people in politics and positions of power locally. So that switch over is not that easy. Then you have Afrocentrism, which doesn't focus on replacing, but it's sort of shifting, right? So it decenters European knowledges and puts local and indigenous knowledges at the center, right? So this is a much lighter approach to the previous one. However, it still carries this risk of romanticizing local and indigenous knowledges as infallible. Whereas when we look at the global picture, all knowledges are contestable and all knowledges are fallible and open to deliberation. So that idea of just switching over and sticking to one knowledge group can also has its risk. The third one is knowledge as entanglement, right? And this stance argues that knowledges are entangled and inseparable in the way that they're not actually regional. So you might have knowledge that come from China or Asia or Islamic history that have now impacted how we function in society today, whether it's mathematics or philosophy. So the idea that knowledge is not just rooted in one region, but it has traveled across space and time. Now, the problem with this stance is that if the previous 2 approaches are not taken, history is often written by the victors, right? So the narrative of how knowledge has traversed space and time is often not acknowledged. And so a conscious effort has to be made to reclaim those histories. And also not just histories, but the present day influence of different regions on the global knowledge base. So just moving on to the dimensions of human injustice. So this is what my work was framed around. So these three angles, I said I would unpack the terms a little bit more. So before I moved into critiquing online courses and online platforms, I needed to understand what I'm critiquing. And a lot of critiques focus on the access, right? So they talk about the digital divide and how that separates people. But I wanted to go beyond that. Something about that seemed incomplete to me. And so I drew on social justice frameworks and decoloniality to put together this dimensions of human injustice in terms of the three lenses that I want to use to unpack my work. So the first one was material injustices, which I think is the most straightforward. This addresses the causes of resource, infrastructural, geographical, and socioeconomic inequalities stemming from human hierarchies. Then we get to political and geopolitical injustices, and this addresses the international and national relations of power that reproduce class, racial, sexual, gender, geographic, spiritual, and linguistic hierarchies. And you could say something like the international development movement falls under this critique. Then we have cultural-epistemic injustices, which addresses the dominant conceptions of knowledge that exclude different histories, values, narratives, and worldviews. So that is sort of the conceptual framework that I've taken in my research. So now coming a bit more to the practical sides again. My research looked at different categories. So the question was, what are justice-oriented MOOCs, right? And it was really difficult because what I realized was just like there's not one type of injustice, there's also not one approach to addressing injustices, and different approaches are needed at different times. And so I came up with a sort of different hierarchies of what justice-oriented MOOCs could be, right? So the first one, MOOCs that perpetuate injustices, that clearly isn't justice-oriented. This would be a MOOC that gives, for example, historical narratives which exclude certain histories and viewpoints, whether intentionally or inadvertently, right? So it could be a history course that has left out the view of a certain group within a specific war, for example. Then you have MOOCs that are based on open philosophies, but don't actually particularly address injustices. And you might get this more in like the techie or the computer science space, where a MOOC might teach using openly licensed material or software, but it doesn't quite remove the technological, cultural, or linguistic barriers that MOOCs can propagate. Then the third one is a MOOC that strives for justice, but not necessarily through actively including the marginalized in its target group. So what does this mean? Let's say you have a course that guides engineers about how to consider the social and environmental impacts of their design. So this is something that's clearly going to strive to address inequalities in society, but the actual people who the course is addressed for isn't the most marginalized groups. It's sort of a middleman between that. So they do strive for injustice, but they're not targeted directly at including and allowing the most marginalized to participate in the space. And the third one, the justice-oriented MOOCs that strive to include marginalized groups and their knowledges through removing barriers to access and participation. So this might be a MOOC that actually is designed in a way that can include people that are based in rural or remote areas, that people who might not have that the education level. So having courses that design from the basic, so to include people that can then be carried over. So not just jumping to a course that might need someone to have 3 years of a university degree before they can access that knowledge. Great. So moving on to the core arguments of my research that I'm going to present today. So the first one I've already mentioned, and that is that there's no one-size-fits-all framework to creating justice-oriented MOOCs. And today I'll talk about 3 different approaches. So justice as content, justice as pedagogy, and justice as process are the 3 approaches that I'm going to unpack. So here it's really crucial to understand that you need to unpack an online course in terms of the target group, in terms of the philosophical underpinnings of the course, and how these factors will impact the different approaches to justice-oriented learning design. The next part is that course designers need to examine their own subjectivities and how these shape the epistemological framing of the course from its conceptualization. So we often talk about courses passively, right? We don't think about them as active, as a human being that's creating this course, not as just content and matter that is being formed. So bringing the human element back into the course and understanding that dynamics. And the third one is that greater emphasis is needed on factors outside the construction of the course curriculum. So factors beyond the content, the outcomes, assessment, processes, and pedagogy, and even the praxis of it. So that's all the stuff that happens inside of a course. We want to look at the environmental factors that surround a course or a MOOC. Great, so approaches to designing justice-oriented MOOCs. So now I'll flip over to the more practical elements of this, and we can have a little bit of chats at different points throughout this. So the first thing I want to do is explain the different levels. So in these approaches, and again, it's what I call decision-making spheres, because it's not really a single flow of from one phase to the next, but it's rather decision makings at different levels where different people have the power to influence decisions. So the first sphere is framing MOOC production, and this is where the high level decisions are made at an institutional level. It might be the management, for example, that chooses a specific platform. Let's say they want to use Coursera or edX, right? Or they've decided that this is what the MOOC needs to be about. So in today's conversation, I'm not going to be talking about this level because I don't think that's the audience I have today. The next level is conceptualizing the MOOC. And this is where MOOC designers will unpack their philosophical underpinnings, their assumptions, and the purposes in the target group when they are in the phase of brainstorming what the MOOC needs to be about, right? And you can, whenever I say MOOC, then you can just replace that with online course if that's what you're teaching at the moment. The next part is situating the MOOC, which is what I mentioned earlier about looking at factors that surround the MOOC rather than what's in the content itself. And the fourth sphere is constructing and implementing the MOOC, which is where most of you might be familiar with, looking at different pedagogical approaches, participation, content, activities, and assessments. But over here also, I want to mainly emphasize power structures within course design, particularly between the facilitators or the instructors of a MOOC and the participants that attended. So let's jump into conceptualizing the MOOC. So the MOOC design, this was one of the core angles of my research. And here, the argument here is that the more epistemically diverse the people are who are at the decision-making table, the more inclusive a MOOC will be. Because these people are the people that set the tone and the ethos of what the MOOC is. And in my research, I looked at different factors of MOOC designers' identities based on their race, their gender, their social class, their different life experiences. And what the research showed is strong correlation between the MOOC designers or course designers' identities and how they strove for justice within their MOOC. Right, their identities shape the purpose, the target group, the pedagogies, the approaches, who they want to include, what platforms they wanted to use was strongly linked to who they are. Now, you might say that then if it's so linked to the identity, then what, right? Then you have a MOOC that's only designed by one person. So the first step is acknowledging that a MOOC designer has all of these frames of reference, but then also realizing to invite other people. So for example, if you know that you have a certain perspective, then the next thing is to invite people from other perspectives. So experts, practitioners, teaching assistants, or students to take part in the formulation of the MOOC to ensure that you get multiple perspectives at the table. And specifically for MOOCs or online courses in the university space, we tend to focus on bringing different academics in, by trying to break that barrier and like look at NGOs or practitioners that are working in a space and the students themselves to bring them in. So focusing on these partnerships and doing this at the conceptual stage, not just saying, hey, I have a lecture that needs to be about, I don't know, gender, and then you call someone in to talk about gender. So helping these people be at the decision-making table to decide what the purpose of the course is going to be about. Right. Now, here's the 3 different approaches that I was talking about. So when a course is designed, you can strive for justice in it in 3 different broad ways. And okay, so the justice as content, right? So this ensures content is contextually relevant depending on the purpose and the target participation. So this could focus not just on reading lists, but on images, the names, the sites that are used, and contextually relevant examples. And just to give you a quick example from one of the EdTech platforms I was reviewing. So they were trying to do maths in a very scenario-based way, which was very lovely because they gave a descriptive story of pizzas and used that to as a way to explain fractions. But in the specific Ghanaian community, they didn't really understand pizzas because there wasn't a common food in that place. And so they first had to understand the concept of like, what is a pizza, and the fact that it's cut up into these triangle shapes to understand. So using a concept that is foreign to a specific place might not be the most relevant. So that's just an example of content, right? Then we look at justice as pedagogy. So this is ensuring that a space within the learning environment is created for co-creation, for creativity, for critical thinking. So this can be done through debates or scenario-based role-playing or peer reviewing or Socratic questioning, which is basically, asking a question, posing an answer, and someone has to respond to that question until you come to something that is closer to the truth. Then the last one is justice as process. And this then goes back to what I was saying, like who is at the table, right? So ensuring that there's a diversity of stakeholders and that they bring in a plurality of ideas and a diversity of cultures in the decision-making processes. So bringing in those students at that level, bringing in practitioners, bringing in different viewpoints that can help you shape the aims and objectives and philosophies that are embedded in a course. So this could be blogs or open textbooks, different ways of including different voices in that process stage. So the main thing that I looked at in this research was understanding people's positioning and their framing. And so what I learned from this is that MOOC designers or course designers need to examine and make explicit their own philosophical underpinnings and their underlying assumptions and their preconceived notions that frame the course that they're in. So, for example, what are the underlying philosophical assumptions that a MOOC designer has? So this could be religious views. It could be how you view the sacredness of nature, what you deem as evidence or knowledge, and what you deem as, folklore. how do you perceive a family? Like, what is the structure of a family? Is it, two kids, a dog, a car in the garage, or is it an idea of, an interconnected community, including your neighbors and aunts and relatives? Different cultures have different stereotypes about what a family means. Then looking at what agendas are promoted or counted, right? And the thing is, there's always an agenda. I have an agenda right now. I'm promoting this idea of a decolonial perspective, right? There's always going to be a perspective or an argument or approach. And we need to often think deeply about what is that agenda. It could just be like, oh, I've push forward a constructivist idea of education, or I'm taking a specific viewpoint in science or mathematics, or I work under this scholarship. So there's always different schools of thought. So making explicit that, and it's fine to have that angle, but to make explicit that this is not the only view, that there are other views and you're talking from this perspective. And then look at what epistemological understandings you have in terms of how knowledge is formed and how learning happens. So again, coming then to the idea of what pedagogies do you use in your teaching, and what you believe. And this is also linked to the MOOC designer's personality and how they're comfortable teaching. So here I want to pause for a second, and I want everyone to think about a course that either they have recently supported designing, or a course that they have participated in. And think about if a different person had delivered that course, what do you think might have changed? And were there any particular agendas, either something that was hidden or explicit, that could be promoted or encountered? And one example of that might be a course that I did a few years back on promoting inclusive education. And that means that learners with disabilities would be part of mainstream schools rather than, one aspect of this, rather than having separate special needs schools. So whether that, even though, many of us would see that as a good thing, that is still an agenda. Agenda doesn't need to be a negative thing, but it is a specific viewpoint about something. So I'm just going to pause here for a minute, and then ask some people to feedback and see what they have to say. So does anyone want to share any thoughts on this? Feel free to unmute and share a specific example that you might have. So Mohammed Ahmed, can I pick on you? Because I know that you work in the space, so you might have some thoughts. Oh, Tony, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a course in learning theory at a postgrad diploma level that I'm involved in convening, and where I kind of lightly redesigned it from what it was before I was teaching it. But I thought, well, somebody else teaching the course would have a different balance perhaps in the range of theories that they taught, and what emphasis they placed on particular theories over others, rather than plaguing the entire class with this very strong emphasis on cultural historical activity theory, of course, among others, but it would be different.
Yeah. And I think a way to address that is that if that's your expertise, then getting someone in with expertise from slightly different angles to include those different perspectives in it. Anyone else that has some thoughts on this?
Oh, hi. Maybe I could just make a quick comment. I mean, my background is slightly different. We've been looking at work-based learning courses, So immediately you're in the realm of relevance and authenticity because you're trying to develop courses that are relevant to, you know, the real world. And I just wonder if this is slightly esoteric in the sense that there are many ways you can skin a cat. As long as you achieve the same outcomes and you're successful in doing that, and you don't deliberately cause injustices in that process, so you are aware of that. Are we in danger here of ruling out that flexibility by imposing a sort of a justice-based system in the way we think about the pedagogical design of these courses?
I love that question, Chris. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you how exactly exploring that, like different approaches to taking something. So justice doesn't mean that justice is one approach. So my exact point is that different approaches can be taken based on different needs. So I'll be looking at how 3 different courses were designed, taking different justice approaches and how the pros and cons of each method, not that one is particularly better than the other. Eunice. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just looking at, I'm not going to give an example of a course, but I'm looking at your question and the way you are asking if somebody else facilitated it. The issue is that we all know that anytime, even without using a social justice agenda, if a course is offered by a different person, it just reflects that person's philosophy, ideologies, not necessarily what the other person was using. Even if theories are changed or the same theories are used in the course, the way I present it and the way Tony would present it would really be informed by our experiences or ideologies. And what I want to say is that the fact that a course is being offered by another facilitator following their own ideologies doesn't really necessitate the fact that it is a social justice agenda. So yeah, I would like to hear you comment that, because you can change facilitators and still the course is not on addressing social injustices. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. And the stage when I'm talking about exploring your different philosophical underpinnings, it doesn't mean that some people can't, and let me just put it frankly, right? It doesn't mean that, okay, only a Black woman will ever be able to talk about this issue because you know, she is the one that will understand the most marginalized, right? No, it's actually just about reflecting on your positionality in the space, and then to understand which parts, like what are your hidden agendas and how you can make sure that, for example, and this is an example that might come up in the next few slides, like if you are a white male, how does that position, and it's not always about race, by the way, it could be a specific subject, it could be a disability, it could be many different aspects that help you to either position yourself differently. So it's about making those explicit and then seeing how you can make sure that different perspectives. So if you say Tony and you present in different ways, what are the positives that in the way that Tony is presenting? What are your positives? What are you lacking? What is he lacking? And how can you ensure that those different elements are brought into your course to support learners? Okay, I'm going to jump onto the next slide because I feel like it'll help to respond to some of Chris's and Eunice's questions. All right, so this comes to a bit about looking at the different target groups. So here are work seekers in different types of groups, Chris, which kind of speaks to your point. So now, one part of everything that I was talking about is who are the MOOC designers, but there's also who is the target group, who are you speaking from? And you need to really think about who is the audience. So they could come from, like marginalized doesn't mean one thing, right? They could be from rural areas. It could be a minority ethnic group. It could be refugees. different socioeconomic levels. Then with online courses, you have a different approach if you know, addressing undergraduate students or postgraduate students. If you're looking at professionals, so if it's about you know, someone who is already working in industry and they just want to have an extra course to supplement their, you know, continued development. It could be people who are looking for work, so they're trying to enhance their computer skills, for example, or web design or graphic design to help them to find a job. And then there's, you know, some people who aren't really about an instrumental reason for getting knowledge. They just want to learn more about science or history or religion, and that's might be why they're coming to an online course. So you have different target groups. So another quick little activity here is, when you think of conceptualizing the different target groups, what factors do you think about when designing for a diverse target group? So the most obvious ones that come up are like, you know, looking at people's different ages or genders or sexualities. So what are the different contextual factors that you might think about when you're thinking about the target group of your course? So again, you can write it in, if you want to write it in the chat, you can, or you can just unmute and share. Does anyone wanna share anything? So for example, you might say, I want to ensure that I'm catering to the different gendered needs of my group, or I'm ensuring that I'm, you know, yeah, whatever it might be.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And regarding designing for diverse group, and I think when you mentioned earlier, for the groups, one of the things that we often sometimes also don't think so much about, it's about the persons with disabilities and how they engage with some of these online programs. And so it's very important that we make it as inclusive as possible. So beyond the different ages, gender, sexualities, now the needs assessment, so that it helps us target persons with disabilities in a way that will make our courses more accessible and inclusive, becomes very relevant as part of our contextual designing factors as well. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. That's an excellent example. And so on this next slide, I think this is also in here. So basically, I've sort of mapped out the main things that have come out, and here, and relating to your point, is like differently abled people, right, is one of them here. And this is by all means not exhaustive, but these are just things that I've brainstormed within the space. And so I think we often focus on the stereotypical ones, and I want to highlight some of the things that we don't often think about. So for example, people with different family or parental responsibilities, that can drastically impact the time that you need to, the flexibility that you need to build into the course. People might have you know, different learning abilities. So helping to include all of those in different accesses to device and internet, which is the main one that we often focus on, but also different cultural norms and religious views, right? Different political views, different time zones. There's so many things to think about. So when you're designing a course, intentionally think about all the different groups that you want to reach out to and how you're addressing them in this course. So I think I'm taking a bit long, so I'm going to skip to the next section. So situating the MOOC. So here's the main focus on the technological accessibility here, and the different ways in which you can support, including participants based on the access. So some of the main things that have come up in research is looking at designing for mobile compatibility. So for example, using responsive design techniques that can, size to different phones and phone settings, using shorter videos. So this helps with the buffering and downloading, and it also includes people who have a shorter time availability. Then you have the use of captions, transcripts, and subtitles to support either those who can't speak English, so want to do a course, but they don't speak English. So having subtitles in a different language, or people who are just struggling with English. And I'm saying English here because of that is in South Africa, the language that's used in universities. It might be different in a different country. It will also support participants with hearing impairments. Using descriptive text on images and charts will also support visually impaired learners. Ensuring the content is downloadable and offline, and the use of WhatsApp or instant messaging groups. And basically the idea of using WhatsApp is that it's much more, it's something that participants are familiar with rather than a discussion board built onto a platform, whether it's Moodle or Coursera, edX. There's some concept with it that we've found in research that people are more open to talking through WhatsApp because they're familiar, they chat to it with their friends and family, and it's much less data intensive. So it really allows for a more open space of learning. Now, moving on to language accessibility, the idea this might be something specific for MOOCs, but the idea of MOOCs being global is often in contestation with supporting marginalized groups, because there you want to support different languages, whether it's isiZulu or Venda, for example. Trying to make a MOOC that's global might not reach local participants in the best way. So in order to get around this, the best way is to make sure that the content is reusable and revisable. So if someone is in another country and they want to take this course and make it available in Spanish, is the content downloadable so that another person can reuse it and adapt the content. A big critique within the MOOC space is they often go with, the main languages, let's say English or French or these colonial languages when they talk about language diversity, but they don't realize that languages like Swahili or Hausa or Hindi that are more continental languages have massive amounts of people who can speak these languages, but you often don't see courses adapted in these languages. So I'm going to just jump onto some of the later slides. So looking at supporting a learner within their environment. So from the research and from working with different groups, there was a lot that needed to be done in terms of signposting. So when you create a course, and now I'm just talking about the practical elements in terms of the user design, is making sure, showing participants practically how to navigate through the platform. So not just assuming that they know this arrow means that will take you to the next page, but say, click here to proceed. Very, very simple pointers like that. And have a resource. So one of my favorite courses is the Education for All MOOC that actually had these resources on getting started and getting the best out of your course. So making sure that these are explicit so that people can understand how to use it. And then designing multiple pathways to accommodate the various levels of participants. So if you have participants that are really striving to do stuff, you might have extra exercises, like can you write a blog or can you do extra work, and having a less intense version for someone who doesn't have the capacity to do those extra courses. And again, this is a difference that might not be the same for an online course that is within a specific curriculum, because MOOCs, again, are optional. They how much you want to put into that course. Yeah, so let me just jump on. So situating the learner in terms of being human. So the first thing you want to do is center humans in a course. So when participants join MOOCs, they can often feel lonely in this space. So one of the lessons here was encouraging participants to invite a friend or colleague to do the course with them. So that means that they have someone from their real life that is doing this course with them. It's not a bunch of strangers that they're joining globally. And the MOOC designer themselves also setting that atmosphere of warmth within the course, and being open and personable. Because MOOCs are quite massive, having teaching assistants there to support participation and discussions then also promotes this interactivity space. So there's more people for them to reach out to. And the third one here is looking at course design or MOOC designer training. So just similar to what we're going through today, before someone becomes an online course designer or presenter, they should probably go through the questions that I've presented today or another form of training to critically interrogate their process of creating an online course. Now, I'm kind of rushing to jump to this section, which is about creating and implementing a MOOC. So here are different power structures that have come up in the different courses that I reviewed, in terms of how a course was conceptualized and decided. So in some cases, you have a management decreed course, which is someone at the top, maybe the dean has decided there's a specific thing that needs to be done and we need to have a course on this. And then that way it can be somehow top-down led. Then you have expert-led courses who someone is, a famous scientist and they're going to be sharing their expertise on a course. Then you have different instructor-led courses, expert instructor-led courses, but I've also interacted with created room for participant interaction. And then rather than having expert leader, you have expert facilitator, who's someone who's really good at encouraging discussion and bringing knowledge and learning and sharing into it. And then you have student-led courses, which is something that students have decided is important to them, and they've actively sought out to do this. And often this is because they feel a certain voice is not heard, and they want to bring it out. And in Cambridge, we call this unteaching. There were a range of student-led courses that arose from the fact that we felt curriculums weren't really addressing everyone's diverse voices. And so these power structures sort of map onto different pedagogical approaches. And I'm assuming that in the room today, people are fairly familiar with these different pedagogical approaches. And Chris, this is starting to look at what you were asking earlier. There's different ways in which you can approach something, but it's important to not think that one way is the right way. At some point, I think instructivist approaches are often critiqued as too top-down or, too much like you're just transferring content. But in some cases, you do need to do that. So there's a place and time for different approaches. And so just going through the middle few, constructivist approaches are supporting participants to construct their own knowledge and go through a meaning-making process. So it's often action-based or inquiry-based, whereas social constructivist approaches do the same thing, but they rely on learning from peers. So making sure there's group work or social learning or experience and collaboration built into it. Socratic approaches I mentioned earlier, which is a dialectical process through dialogue to come through and unravel and discover truth. And liberationist approaches are ones that aim to gain a critical consciousness, to question relations of power and to bring about the voices of the oppressed. So there's different pedagogies embraced in here. So again, maybe if you just have a few moments to talk about some of these pedagogical approaches. So do you have any examples or activities or topics that would be best used? Would you use a specific approach for any of these, for a specific activity or topic or lesson? Maybe if you just have one person comment and then I'll move on.
Perhaps I could just make a comment. I don't think it's a question. But do you think the massification of education rules out the possibility of some of those pedagogies? I mean, it's very difficult to do the dialectic approach or tutorial approach with MOOCs because of the vast numbers of people you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think in that case, it's a good question. I think you would probably you would probably merge that. So if you wanted to use that Socratic dialectical approach, and this is one of the examples I'll give in a bit that was used in a course, it might not just be directly with the expert designer and the participant. It might be with peers, for example. So you could still have that dialectical process. So an idea of in some MOOCs, there's this idea of like they might ask you philosophical questions and you need to like respond to an answer, and then that answer is switched with another student, and you can interact so that you can still engage. There's still ways of discussion to have that interaction. But you're right that if it's all massive, not everyone's going to be linking to the main speaker. I want to move on to this next slide here. This will kind of unpack and try to answer like Chris's line of thinking. So in my research, I looked at 3 different courses that were all focused on this idea, like they were all courses that were trying to strive for justice or a decolonial approach, right? So A, B, and C. And they all took very different approaches, although the purpose or if you read the paragraph, the blurb that described the course, you might think that it's the same course, right? But they took very different approaches. So the first one was by a university who at the management level decided they needed to have a course to bring a more African vibe to the university, right? And they created this course, but it was done in a very top-down way. They outsourced the building of the curriculum to a specific agency, and they put together a bunch of content from different African scholars and poets and philosophers, and they created a very African course, right, that talked about different leaders in African history. But the process that they used meant that they didn't really engage with learners, and the output was also very much like a multiple choice MCQ sort of thing. And this course was for institutional credit, so every first year had to do it. So in this course, they took quite a justice as content perspective. Like they felt like, look, we're talking about our different African heroes and literatures and cultures. So, we've decolonized, right? And then the second one was a similar course, actually at the same university, who took a very bottom-up approach. So students decided they wanted to bring in these decolonial perspectives into their education space, and they came together. And so these students, they didn't have the resources to do what the institutional level did. But what they did is they created blogs and different podcasts from different students speaking about this. So it was a much more ground up perspective because the process was different. They really focused on including different voices into that, including different methods of including different perspectives. But because they didn't have funding, they couldn't make the actual. So in the development of the course, they included different voices, but in the actual course itself, there still wasn't much room for engagement because they didn't have the resources to support having more tutors or more people support the demand, like you're saying, Chris, of all the participants. Then in the third course, a specific lecturer who was quite prominent in this field set up a course to look at understanding different philosophies in African thought, right? And in this one, the topic was somewhat decided by the expert, right? But so in terms of a process of bringing in different voices in the creation, that didn't quite happen. But in the teaching, he embodied a very much justice as pedagogy approach. So even though it was a massive course, there was different case studies, there's different videos and readings and critical assignments for people to engage within a Socratic method. So I think, Tony, you had asked a question about, like, can you have justice as pedagogy without the other two? So this was kind of an example of, like, this expert had already decided what is the content. And then from that point onwards, there was quite an interesting and interactive pedagogy, but it didn't quite, not in the creation space. So he was still the expert, and that expert might have changed the dynamics. Like, are you really going to speak up if someone's an expert? Are you going to challenge them? So what are the power dynamics within that space? So while there was a lot of critical discussion, there was still power dynamics at play. So moving on to looking at ways to encourage participation. The first one is using forum discussions and questions within this. So this has never really worked that well. Forum discussions on platforms have often had this concept of, like, someone shouting out in a loud room and not having much feedback heard from them. What has worked is having, like, mini Q&A podcast sessions. So in this particular course, participants were able to submit questions that week, and then the course designer would make an audio to reply to those questions. So it doesn't need high quality video production or, you know, a live webinar. It just had, like, a podcast to respond to those questions, an audio basically. And this also was easier for participants with low connectivity to be able to hear the responses. The idea of Facebook pages, and this is a bit dated, so I don't know if this is still, like, how popular Facebook is these days, but at least 2 years back, Facebook was still quite a prominent way of creating communities beyond the course. So even when a course ended, people would come together and use the Facebook page for interactivity and for sharing content. WhatsApp groups, I've already mentioned before, have been really great at encouraging informal discussions. And last but not least, in-person learning groups. So even though you're creating an online course that could be massive, you could have different learning groups formed in different areas, either by a specific topic. Maybe, you know, you're all maths educators and you want to meet up and talk about something, or maybe you're all from Cape Town and you want to meet up and talk about something. So having different learning groups to interact with people. The next is just looking at the different types of content. So I think this is almost self-explanatory in the first one, like, you know, whether it's using images, videos, podcasts, reading materials, but then also looking at the types of content, right? So you might want to have a mixture of these different things. So it could be expert content, or it could be new emerging research. It could be theory, skills, case studies, scenarios, bringing in current affairs, provocations, or personal stories. So trying to think of the diversity of content that you want to bring into your course. And then looking at how, if you're using videos, because it's an online course, looking at when you need a talking head. So right now I am a talking head, right? So having just someone speak at a camera and not using the full abilities that you could with videos, like, for example, doing on-site filming at different locations. Then, you know, using more charts and interactivity. So trying to bring in the best that you can at different, using video. So not just using it to record someone speaking. Then you have different types of presenters that I've mentioned, trying to mix up the type of people that share content. And then looking at pedagogically diverse voices and critical thought from participants themselves. The last point that I want to raise is it's a point that's very specific to MOOCs rather than to general courses. But what I've seen within the South African space is that Africanness is sometimes used as a selling point. So like, you know, selling point to the global audience of like, look, we have this African MOOC. This is, you know, this is our brand. Our Africanness becomes our brand. But although that is, you know, bringing about epistemic justice in that, you know, we're putting our African knowledges on, and it's not one knowledge, it's plural, we're putting it on par with others. It's actually sometimes counterintuitive because you're actually excluding your local. So if you're making a course that's selling Africa, but you're not actually internally reaching the most marginalized in your own group, that can be a problem. So I've written here, some MOOCs seem to be about developing countries rather than for developing country contexts. So looking at like, okay, if you were designing a course internally, you might want to include more local languages rather than global languages. So I'm going to pause here, and we do have 15 minutes. I was going to do some breakouts, but I'm wondering how many participants do we have? Should we do 2 breakout groups and then come back in maybe we can just do maybe a 10-minute breakout and then come back together?
Ready to set up if you want?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, setting up for 10 minutes with a 30-second countdown timer, opening the rooms right now. Okay.
So could I ask someone from each group to reflect on their learnings in the group? So I think Chris, Eunice, you guys were in the other group. Do you want to share what you guys talked about? And Relitza, do you want to be the nominee for our group? And I think we just have 2 minutes, so maybe like just a 30-second summary. Maybe Chris?
Okay, I'll try. I wasn't really concentrating on doing this, so I'm probably going to leave big gaps. But we seem to have a discussion about whether, well, for me, what I came away with is really something Tony said, which is this focusing on MOOCs is proper, and we need to do it. But actually, the principles that we're talking about here apply to all teaching and learning. Okay, not just in MOOCs. All these good practices that you're coming out with, they need to take place in face-to-face teaching. You need to be aware of what your students' abilities are, and so on and so forth. They're not something special to MOOCs. And we had a little bit of discussion between the difference between MOOCs and LMS systems used mainly in universities. So I'm sure I've not covered a lot of things here. So as I said, I wasn't prepared, didn't take any notes, etc. But I think that's that main takeaway that I had. I personally also stressed that I felt that we didn't talk enough about assessment. And I think social injustices can occur through assessment as much as through content, irrelevant content or inappropriate content, or indeed inappropriate teaching methods. So the third part of that triangle, assessment, I didn't feel was addressed, and I think we do need to look at that quite carefully. So forgive me, people, because I'm sure I haven't represented all your views, and I'm sure you can now chip in if Taskeen will let us to fill in anything I missed out. So thank you for your patience.
Happy for anyone else to chip in if you want.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Relitza.
Okay, so thank you so much. And we had a very interesting conversation, although short, it was okay. We spoke a lot about accessibility, etc. And we also talked about the fact that there's a need for us to consider different languages, even a local language, if we can customize some of our learning activities in a way that learners can switch over to the local languages so that it doesn't limit them in a way. That will also help with their learning. And we spoke about when it comes to persons with special needs, we can also think about using sign language for, let's say, demonstrative videos, etc. That will also help. And we said that there's so much potential out there to help persons with disabilities when it comes to learning online, but it will happen if it is intentionally designed. So the keyword was intentionally designed, so then it will be able to provide the needed outcome. And as our previous presenter said, some of these things are also present in our in-person learning environment. It's not only applicable to MOOCs, but if we can intentionally design these strategies as part of the learning, then we can ensure that no one is left behind. And one last thing was about the fact that coming out of COVID, we sometimes feel that when it comes to online learning, it's all about getting devices and internet, but digital literacy skills, etc. If someone doesn't have it, it can also inhibit the person from accessing the content. So it goes beyond the internet and having access to devices, etc. So that was where we were at. And I hope I've done a quick summary. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Relitza. That was actually a perfect summary. I think the point intentional was literally the summary of my whole research. It's like, be explicit about your own positionality, about what you're doing going into this course. And what are your strengths? What are you lacking? How can you make sure that all the voices are represented in this teaching? And completely agree that these are all principles that are applicable to in-person teaching as well, and sort of LMS level teaching. The only difference is the massiveness, but I think the massiveness helps to understand, because it's very obvious when you have a massive course that people are from different cultures and perspectives. But that's also the case in a normal classroom. We just don't see it that often. So completely take the point that this is just as relevant in in-person teaching. We're at time, so I do want to stop here. And yeah, hand over back to the organizers. Thank you all so much for your time. Yeah. Yes, like your comment as well, Tony.
Taskeen,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so much. You brought us something absolutely marvelous. I just think that so much is about the design principles of courses generally. So much is about the design principles of online and blended courses that do not have to be MOOCs. And I think that you have found a beautiful way to infiltrate and subvert learning design orthodoxies from the MOOC design angle. And I think that you shared a massive and beautiful and powerful resource with us, not just a conversation which will disappear after this. It'll get us thinking. Be great to share, if you can share the presentation as well, and then we can share it with our whole network. And I think the ripple effects will continue well beyond the size of the participant group in the event today. Jakob, I'm wondering if you have a evaluation form for the event, or if you're going to circulate that after the event, because with the Zoom signups, we do know how to contact people.
I do,
Okay,
Tony, and I've
great.
just pasted it right in the chat there, and it's a very short one. It's 4 questions, and it's not going to be a very long one, because we are aware that people are sometimes a bit tired of of service of those kinds, but it's very short, and we appreciate your feedback.
So massive applause to you, Taskeen. Thank you.
Sorry, Relitza, were you saying something?
Yeah, I think.
Sound is going weird, Relitza.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
The presentation. I'm excited. Yes.
Can you share Tasneem's email, please?
Oh,
Tony?
yes. Yes. I forgot to put it.
Taskeen, yeah.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can stop recording.
Yeah.